There is an office on the third floor of the Pentagon's E-Ring that belongs to the Secretary of the Navy. It has a view, a flag, and a title that places one civilian above every admiral, every carrier, every destroyer on patrol. Right now, that office is empty. John Phelan is gone, departed mid-tenure, mid-blockade, mid-everything. And at this exact moment, a carrier strike group is operating within strike range of the Strait of Hormuz. Arleigh Burke class destroyers are holding a patrol line. Sailors are standing watch. FC-18 Super Hornets are on the flight deck, armed and ready. And the fleet has not skipped a single beat. That is the paradox at the center of this briefing. The top civilian over the most powerful navy in the world just walked out the door during an active Gulf blockade, and nothing on the water changed. Not the patrol routes, not the rules of engagement, not the readiness posture of a single ship. So either the Navy Secretary doesn't actually matter, or the vacancy is costing something that isn't visible yet. One of those is true, the other is dangerously comfortable. Stay with us, because the answer is not what either side of that question wants to hear. To understand why the fleet doesn't flinch, you have to understand what the Secretary of the Navy actually controls. And more importantly, what the Secretary of the Navy does not control. The United States Navy operates under two parallel chains that look like one thing on an org chart, but function almost nothing alike in practice. The first is the administrative chain. This runs from the President down through the Secretary of Defense, currently Pete Hegseth, and then to the Civilian Service Secretaries, of which the Secretary of the Navy is one. This chain controls budgets, force structure, acquisition programs, personnel policy, and the long-range shape of the fleet. It answers the question, what kind of navy does the United States build and sustain? The second chain is the operational chain. This runs from the President through the Secretary of Defense directly to the combatant commanders. In the Middle East, that means U.S. Central Command. From CENTCOM, authority flows to the Naval Component Commander, then down to the Strike Group Commander, then to individual ship captains. This chain controls where ships go, what they do when they get there, and under what conditions they are authorized to use force. It answers a different question entirely. What does the Navy do right now? The Secretary of the Navy sits firmly in the first chain, not the second. When an Arleigh Burke destroyer on patrol in the Gulf of Oman gets a threat contact, say fast boats maneuvering toward a tanker corridor, or a Shahed 136 drone lifting off the Iranian coast, the commanding officer does not call Washington. The commanding officer does not wait for a civilian secretary. The ship's combat system, built around the Aegis combat system with its SPY-1 radar and linked fire control network, is already tracking the contact. Decision authority flows through CENTCOM. The political threshold question was already set by the rules of engagement, proved at a level well above any single service secretary. That architecture was not designed by accident. It was designed precisely because the people who built the post-World War II defense structure understood that operational continuity could not be held hostage to the churn of civilian appointments. Secretaries come and go, administrations change, confirmation processes stall. The logic encoded into the command structure is that the operational machine must run regardless, and for decades it has. Here is the historical baseline worth stating plainly. Since 1947, the United States Navy has never halted an active operational deployment because of a civilian leadership vacancy at the service secretary level. Not once. Secretaries have resigned mid-crisis, died in office, been fired by presidents, been replaced during wars. The ships kept sailing. That continuity rate is not luck. It is doctrine. The gap between John Phelan's departure and whoever eventually fills that chair will be covered by an acting secretary. Almost certainly a senior career official or an undersecretary already confirmed by the Senate. The acting authority carries the same formal powers over the administrative chain. The operational chain doesn't notice the difference because it was never plugged into that socket in the first place. But here's where the comfortable story starts to crack. What's most surprising about this vacancy isn't the political drama around it. It's how precisely the damage is timed to be invisible right now and consequential later. Let's walk through the layers. The first layer is force posture. The strike group currently near the Strait of Hormuz is built around a Nimitz-class or Gerald R. Ford-class carrier, tens of thousands of sailors, dozens of aircraft, surface combatants, and at least one fast attack submarine operating in the wider theater. That group is on deployment. Deployment orders were cut months ago. Logistics trains are in motion. The patrol line for the Arleigh Burke destroyers was set by CENTCOM planners, not by the SecNav's office. From a pure force posture standpoint, the vacancy changes nothing about what is already at sea. The second layer is the cost of continuity argument, and this is where the numbers start to matter. Sustaining a carrier strike group forward in the Gulf region runs somewhere between $2 and $4 million per day in operating costs alone. Fuel, maintenance cycle consumption, munitions expenditure, logistics support. That clock runs whether the SecNav chair is occupied or empty. The fleet doesn't discount its burn rate for administrative gaps. The sailors on watch at 0300 local time over the Hormuz shipping lanes are standing that watch regardless of what is happening in the E-ring. What the vacancy does affect quietly, with a delay, is the authorization pipeline for the decisions that sustain the next deployment. Which shipyard availabilities get prioritized? Which surface combatant goes into dry dock and when? Whether the next Arleigh Burke class hull in the construction queue gets its funding obligation signed on time, these are SecNav decisions, not CENTCOM decisions. And when the chair is empty, these decisions either wait, get delegated down to acting authority with less political weight, or get made by default, which usually means the least controversial option, not the best one. The third layer is the readiness arithmetic. Here is a number that matters. The US Navy currently operates just over 300 ships. Of those, roughly a third are in some phase of maintenance, overhaul, or depot-level repair at any given time. The prioritization of that maintenance pipeline, which ships get accelerated for deployment, which get delayed, flows through the Service Secretary's office. It is not a combat decision. It is a logistics and funding decision. An empty chair doesn't stop today's patrol. It creates friction in the decisions that determine whether next quarter's patrol is fully resourced. I spent time going through the maintenance backlog figures for the surface fleet, and one pattern keeps coming up. The periods of highest readiness degradation in the US Navy's recent history correlate not with combat losses but with periods of sustained administrative underfunding and delayed maintenance decisions. Exactly the kind of decisions that get deferred when civilian leadership is in flux. The fourth layer is the political signal problem. The Strait of Hormuz blockade, the threatening of American naval presence against Iranian pressure on tanker traffic, is not purely a military operation. It is a diplomatic signal delivered through steel hulls. The credibility of that signal depends partly on the coherence of the political leadership behind it. A visible vacancy at SecNav is not a military weakness, but it is a legibility problem. Adversaries read American civil-military relations as an indicator of resolve. An empty chair at the top of the Navy's civilian structure, during a Gulf standoff, during an administration already generating friction at the Pentagon under Pete Hegseth, is a data point that gets read in Tehran, in Beijing, and in Riyadh. That reading may be wrong. The operational machine is intact. But in deterrence theory, perception is not incidental. It is half the mechanism. Here's the take that will probably get some pushback. The argument that a SecNav vacancy is no big deal because operations continue looks correct from the flight deck and is potentially catastrophic when viewed from the shipyard. The people making that argument are measuring the right variable, operational continuity, at the wrong timescale. The destroyer on patrol today was funded, built, crewed, and maintained through 100 small decisions made by civilian leaders over the last decade. The SM-6 interceptors in its magazine were acquired through a procurement process that required SecNav authorization at multiple steps. The Aegis combat system upgrade cycle that keeps that ship combat relevant runs through a budget process the Service Secretary shapes directly. None of that is visible from the flight deck at 0300 over Hormuz. All of it is what makes the flight deck possible. Put yourself in the position of a surface warfare officer 6 months into a deployment, knowing that the maintenance availability scheduled for their ship's next hull entry is sitting in a funding queue that nobody at the top of the Navy's civilian chain is currently driving. That officer doesn't feel the SecNav vacancy today. They feel it when they pull into Bahrain and get told their availability has slipped 3 months because the authorization didn't move. The cost asymmetry in this story runs in 2 directions at once, and it's worth putting the numbers side by side. On one side, the immediate cost of the vacancy is approximately 0. The operational chain runs. The ships sail, the patrols continue. The acting authority covers the administrative necessities. This is the visible front, and it looks untouched because it is untouched. On the other side, a sustained vacancy, one that stretches from weeks into months, compounds against the readiness account. The U.S. Navy's shipbuilding and maintenance budget runs in the hundreds of billions across the 5-year defense plan. Decisions deferred by even a quarter have cascading effects on ship availability rates, which cascade into deployment scheduling, which cascade into how many hulls are available for the next contingency. The blockade at Hormuz is a current operation. The readiness fight is a 6-month, 12-month, 36-month operation happening simultaneously. What strikes me about this moment is that the two timescales are almost perfectly designed to fool observers. The short timescale, today, this week, this deployment looks fine because it is fine. The long timescale, next year's fleet availability, the shipyard queue, the procurement pipeline, is where the vacancy bites, and by the time that bite is visible, the connection back to a single leadership gap will be blurred by a dozen other factors. This is how institutional costs accumulate invisibly, not in a crisis moment, but in the quiet decisions that nobody is watching because the carrier is on the news. Here is a number that anchors the scale of what is actually at stake in the readiness argument. The United States spends more on naval power than the next several competitors combined. That spending buys an enormous amount of capability, but it also creates an enormous amount of complexity to sustain. An Arleigh Burke class destroyer costs roughly $2 billion to build. The combat system integration, the weapons fit, the crew training cycle add another significant fraction of that over the ship's service life. The SM-6 interceptor, the primary long-range air defense weapon on those destroyers, runs over $4 million per round. The Phalanx Suez, the last-ditch close-in defense system that spins up and fires 20mm tungsten at anything that gets through the outer layers, is cheaper per engagement, but exists because the outer layers can be saturated. The logic of American naval investment is that you buy expensive, capable systems and then sustain them through a continuous funding and maintenance pipeline. Break the pipeline, even briefly, even through something as bureaucratically mundane as a SecNav vacancy during a leadership transition. And the effect is not immediate failure, it is degradation of margin. The Navy doesn't lose capability on day one of a vacant chair. It loses a fraction of the decision-making velocity that keeps the pipeline running at the required pace. Against an adversary strategy explicitly designed to exhaust American logistical patience, whether that is Iranian pressure in the Gulf, Houthi drone and missile campaigns in the Red Sea targeting commercial shipping, or the broader effort to demonstrate that American naval presence is costly to sustain, that degraded margin is not a theoretical problem. It is the target. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea has already demonstrated the cost asymmetry in striking terms. A Shahed 136 costs somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $50,000. An SM-2 or SM-6 intercept costs orders of magnitude more. When the USS Carney, an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, expended multiple interceptors against drone and missile attacks in the Red Sea over the course of several months, the burn rate on the magazine was not matched by a proportional replenishment speed. The industrial base producing SM-6 interceptors is not running at wartime tempo. The decisions that would accelerate that production run through the defense acquisition process, which runs through civilian leadership. An empty SecNav chair is not the reason those production lines are constrained. But a sustained vacancy is exactly the wrong time to have reduced advocacy for accelerating them. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, until you look at the historical pattern. The US has cycled through SecNav transitions during some of its most demanding operational periods without operational disruption. During the 1991 Gulf War, a secretarial transition proceeded without halting naval operations in the Persian Gulf. During the post-2001 buildup, the administrative chain churned through personnel while operational tempos reached historic highs. The Navy's institutional continuity is real and it is tested. What's different now is the combination of factors running simultaneously. The Gulf blockade is an active, high-visibility operation. The broader defense policy environment under Pete Hegseth has already generated significant internal friction, documented in reporting from multiple outlets covering Pentagon leadership dynamics. The shipbuilding industrial base is under documented strain. And the vacancy comes not after a smooth political transition, but amid what multiple reporting sources describe as leadership feuds reaching into the civilian secretariat. That combination is the problem. Not any single element of it, but the overlay. An operational chain that runs perfectly through a routine transition faces higher drag when the transition is occurring against a backdrop of institutional friction and an active contingency at the same time. Here is the cliffhanger embedded in this moment. The operational machine keeps turning today. But what happens to the three decisions sitting in the SecNav's inbox right now? The ones that determine which hulls go into maintenance in Q3, which programs get their next phase authorization, and how the Navy advocates for its budget share in the next supplemental. Those decisions are accumulating a clock. Every week of vacancy is a week those decisions are not being made at full authority. And the blockade's sustainability is measured in months, not days. There is a human dimension to this that the org chart doesn't capture, and it matters for the readiness argument in ways that are easy to undercount. The Navy has approximately 340,000 active duty sailors. At any given moment, roughly 60,000 of them are forward deployed, on ships, at overseas bases, in the operational theaters. The junior sailors on watch on an Arleigh Burke destroyer in the Gulf of Oman are not tracking the SecNav vacancy in any immediate sense. Their immediate world is the Combat Information Center, the radar scope, the threat picture over the strait. But the institutional health of the service, the career pipeline, the retention rates for experienced petty officers and junior officers, the training and qualification pathways, is shaped over time by civilian leadership decisions. The Navy's retention problem, particularly in technical specialties critical to operating and maintaining complex systems like the Aegis combat system, the Mk-41 vertical launch system, and the ship's propulsion plant, is not a combat problem. It is an administrative and cultural problem that the Service Secretary's Office is directly positioned to address. Here's a question worth sitting with. Does a leadership gap at the top of the civilian Navy chain matter most for the ships on the line today, or for the sailors who decide in 6 months whether to re-enlist? The answer determines whether the blockade looks same as December as it does today. The experienced sonar technician who qualifies for the civilian sector at the end of their enlistment, the surface warfare officer who decides the career timeline doesn't match the operational tempo. These are not dramatic events. They don't generate reporting, but they determine the quality of the crews that will man the next Arleigh Burke class destroyer through the next decade of Gulf patrols. An acting secretary can authorize a maintenance cycle. An acting secretary cannot replace the institutional momentum that a fully empowered, confirmed secretary brings to the long-range personnel and readiness fights. The distinction is subtle and it is real. One detail that stuck with me in looking at the historical record of SecNav vacancies. The transitions that produced the most lasting damage were not the ones that lasted the longest, but the ones that coincided with a budget cycle inflection point. A moment when the 5-year defense plan was being written or revised, when program choices were being locked in. A short vacancy at the wrong moment in the budget calendar does more damage than a longer vacancy in a quieter administrative window. The current vacancy is occurring as the fiscal year turns and supplemental appropriations debates are live. The Navy's budget advocacy for shipbuilding, for munitions replenishment, for maintenance acceleration. These are arguments that need a confirmed principle to make them at full weight in the interagency process. An acting secretary carries legal authority but reduced political leverage. In a budget fight, that difference is not theoretical. The ships on the water today are the product of decisions made 5, 10, 15 years ago. The ships that will be on the water in 2030 and 2035 are being funded or not funded in decisions being made right now. The SecNav vacancy is invisible at Hormuz. It is not invisible at the shipyard. Here is what the pattern across multiple past vacancies tells us. Average readiness rates for surface combatants dip modestly but measurably in the 12-month period following an extended civilian leadership gap. Not because of any dramatic failure, but because 100 small optimization decisions don't get made at full velocity. 3% degradation in surface force readiness rates sounds small. Against a fleet of roughly 100 deployable surface combatants, it means roughly 3 ships unavailable that would otherwise have been ready. In a Gulf contingency that is already stretching the deployment schedule, 3 ships is not a rounding error. Comment yes or no. Do you think the US shipbuilding industrial base can absorb 6 months of reduced civilian advocacy at the SecNav level without measurable readiness impact by the end of the year? The actual answer to the paradox posed at the top of this video is this. The architecture that makes the fleet invulnerable to a SecNav vacancy in the short term is the same architecture that makes the vacancy invisible until it becomes a structural problem. The split between the operational chain and the administrative chain was designed for continuity. It works. The destroyers on patrol do not need a confirmed secretary to know their mission. The carrier air wing does not pause FCA-18 Super Hornet flight operations because the E-ring chair is empty. The Aegis system tracks what it tracks regardless of Washington's internal politics, but continuity is not the same as optimization. The operational chain sustains the current fight. The administrative chain shapes the future fight, and the future fight, the one that determines whether the US Navy that arrives at the next Hormuz standoff in 3 years is better resourced or more constrained than the one there today, is being shaped right now at reduced velocity by an acting authority without the full political weight of a confirmed principle. The rule that holds is exactly what it appears to be. Civilian transitions don't stop the fleet. It has held across every administration, every war, every crisis since 1947. It is holding now. The cost being paid, the quiet one, distributed, only legible in retrospect, is the friction accumulating in the decisions nobody is watching while the carrier is on the news. That is how institutional debt works. It doesn't announce itself. It compounds. The most instructive parallel is not another SecNav vacancy. It is the US Navy's maintenance crisis of the mid-2010s. That crisis, which produced the 2017 collisions of the USS Fitzgerald and USS John S. McCain, 2 Arleigh Burke class destroyers, resulting in 17 sailors dead, did not originate in any single decision or any single vacancy. It originated in accumulated readiness and training degradation over years of sustained high operational tempo, under-resourced maintenance, and reduced advocacy for the unglamorous parts of naval readiness at the civilian level. The Fitzgerald collision happened in June 2017. The McCain collision happened in August 2017. The investigations that followed identified systemic failures in training, watch-standing qualification, and maintenance, not failures of combat systems or tactics. The fleet was being run hard and maintained softly, and the administrative chain that should have flagged and corrected those trends had been operating at reduced effectiveness for a sustained period. That is the long tail of a civilian leadership gap. Not an immediate failure, but a contribution to the conditions in which an eventual failure becomes more likely. The sailors on the Arleigh Burke destroyers patrolling the Hormuz blockade line today are trained, qualified, and ready. The question the SecNav vacancy raises is not about them. It is about the sailors who will be on those ships in 3 years, on ships whose maintenance cycle was shaped by decisions made, or deferred, in the next 6 months. The Strait of Hormuz is 35 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows approximately 20% of the world's oil, roughly 17 million barrels per day. The US Navy's presence there is not just a military posture. It is an argument made in steel and sortie rates that the cost of closing that waterway is higher than any adversary wants to pay. That argument is currently being made by ships whose hulls are sound, whose crews are qualified, and whose combat systems are functional. The SecNav vacancy has not changed any of those facts. What it has changed, quietly, at low visibility, with a delay built into the institutional architecture, is the velocity at which the decisions sustaining those facts are being made for the next iteration of the fleet. A blockade is not a battle. It is an endurance contest. Both sides are calculating not just whether they can absorb today's costs, but whether they can absorb this month's costs, this year's costs, the costs of the next deployment, and the one after that. The visible front, the patrol line, the carrier, the Arleigh Burke destroyer's holding position looks untouched. It is untouched. The slow bill is being written elsewhere, in shipyards, in budget submissions, in the inbox of an empty office on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon's E-ring. Which cost would you watch more closely? The one visible at Hormuz today, or the one that shows up in the fleet availability report 6 months from now? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want to understand the full math of what it costs to sustain a carrier strike group through an extended Gulf deployment. The fuel, the munitions burn, the logistics chain, that breakdown is in the next video.